Hello and welcome to lecture number 27, in which we continue our discussion on women related health issues, and we have some very interesting developments and topics. So, we were looking at length at the Dufferin Fund in the last lecture, and one of the important outcomes of the Dufferin Fund, apart from the various hospitals and the institutes they started, so one of the lasting outcomes was the Association of Medical Women in India. So, one of the things we should tell ourselves when we come across these names like association and all that, it's not just about the association itself, it's also something which contributes to the larger culture of modern science. So, modern science has got some particular characteristics like the presence of journals, the presence of public fora, like say the Royal Society or say the Asiatic Society here, and the starting of these kinds of say Indian Science Congress. These are important landmarks not only with regard to those particular fields, but also to the larger culture of modern science and modernity, or about the encounter between the colonial power and native intelligentsia. So, we should also keep that in mind. So, how and why did this association start? So, this was basically started by the European women working in the Dufferin Fund. So, they started it in 1907, following the one which was in Britain itself. So, this was basically, as you would expect, an effort to assert the female voice in the Dufferin Fund among the employees like the doctors and other health related workers, because so here we are not talking about the vicereines and the wives of other ICS and those kinds of officers, so who were there in the committees and in the fund itself. So, here we are talking about the medical staff, the English women medical staff who were working as part of the various Dufferin Fund run institutions, hospitals and other things, and to counter the male dominance in those institutions, this association made a petition in 1909, so calling for at least one female practitioner to be given a seat on the central committee of the Dufferin Fund, and also that the post of the secretary of Dufferin Fund should be given to a woman. And so, I was just talking about the importance of journals. So, these things do matter in kind of propagating your cause and asserting your rights. So, in course of time, they started their own journal, the JAMWI, and one of the things they did was scathing attacks from within the Dufferin Fund about the functioning of the Dufferin Fund. So, that's why I said at the end of the last lecture, there will be more criticisms coming about the Dufferin Fund, and you will see them unrolling now. So, for instance, they call the many provincial and local branches of the fund as very capricious and inefficient. They complained about the waste of resources in the Dufferin hospitals, especially because of the practice of hiring medical women who were not sufficiently qualified or who they called as very incompetent. And they also condemned the misuse of the authority given to IMS civil surgeons over the Dufferin hospitals. So, they are kind of a domineering attitude, and of course, so many of them would be also males. So, that is an important point to be borne in mind. And at a larger level beyond the Dufferin Fund, so now they are not talking about the problems in the Dufferin Fund. So, this was association with a larger purpose. So, they were now talking about even issues of the medical care, the adequate or inadequate for women at large. So, and in that context, they felt that the government should play a more prominent, more proactive role rather than leaving such an important segment of healthcare to charity. And even if it is left to charity, it should not be left to Indian charity or philanthropy, because Indians were incapable of independent efforts. So, that also we should bear in mind, because this association, though it had its own grievances and it's fighting for rights. So this is basically about British women. So they had their own condescending attitude towards Indians. So, and coming back to the question of government, so they saw the neglect of the government, the distance it kept from public health in general, and with regard to women's health. So all of that was seen as an indication of the kind of priority, low level of priority that the government had towards such an important issue as women's medical needs. So they argued for greater government intervention based on several factors. First of all, they felt that it's the rights of, so they are speaking on behalf of the Indian women, that they had a right to that kind of health care, and so there was a responsibility to reduce mortality among women and children, and they were also projecting this as part of gender justice, as part of eugenics. So as I was saying at the beginning of the earlier lecture, so good mothers, healthy mothers, and therefore healthy babies to them produce healthy society. So from that eugenics point of view also, this segment is very important, healthcare, and therefore government should play a very prominent role, and also for its own good. The government itself will elicit a lot of goodwill from the public if it is seen more proactive. And so there should be gender justice. So both to, because this association was started basically deal with issues, concerned about issues about them as workers. So for instance, doctors and all that, here they were talking about gender justice to women, both as patients, mostly Indian patients, and also to the doctors. So government should play a proactive role. If government plays a proactive role, then there's a greater chance of gender justice. And also government's role was particularly buttressed because of the backward state of India, and especially her healthcare as was seen by them. So they basically suggested a sketch of medical reorganization, and of course they would expect what would be the government's excuse. So anything you ask, whether it's reorganization or better organization or new facility, the government will always give the financial excuse. So that's why they said they gave a sketch of a medical reorganization, which is possible even with limited funding. So that doesn't become an excuse, and also giving those kinds of excuses don't go well with the logic of civilizing. If you're calling yourself as a civilizing agent, as an enlightened government and all that, with a great responsibility of lifting people from darkness to light and all those things, then these kinds of frequent excuses sit at odds with those kinds of tall proclamations. And quite embarrassingly, the association pointed out to the situation in some of the princely states. So princely states, as you know, like those kinds of territories which were allowed to be run by the local princes, but who pledged their loyalty to the colonial state, which had its agent resident there. But in matters of general administration, they had a considerable free hand, and especially in matters like health. And so this association pointed out how some of the princely states were having far better healthcare models. I'm asking, so is the imperial government at such a pathetic state compared to even the natives? So that was quite an embarrassing question. So this kind of, so as I said, so the association was campaigning beyond where it originated from the different funds, working facilities, organizations. This campaign had an impact first on the fund itself. So it recognized internally the need for relief and the need to move away from these kind of funding handicaps, and also to move away from the excessive focus on urban areas. So therefore, in 1908, the Dufferin Fund formally requested for an annual grant of 15,000 from the government of India, so that salaries could be increased, giving inflation and the difficult working conditions as reasons, very legitimate reasons. And the fund echoed the calls given by the AMWI for greater government involvement and responsibility. The India office on the one hand acknowledge the difficulties of realizing the ideal of endowments and fundraising and voluntary subscriptions in India, but yet it advised the government not to take too much of the responsibility, not to get too involved, because once the government gets involved, then it won't stop with that. Then there will be recurrent call for demands for more funds. But on the other hand, the Home Secretary here with the Government of India argued that expecting philanthropic medical care to be sufficient would be unrealistic in the Indian context. So, government will and should have a role financially and otherwise. And so, this appeal was successful to an extent, and the Secretary of State morally allowed the Dufferin Fund to be granted an amount which will be equivalent to the subscriptions it collected. So, there is that binding clause, so that at the same time that is also not lost sight of the focus on philanthropy and public subscriptions. So, whatever the government will give will be also dependent on, proportionally dependent on what is collected through the other route. And there were two particular conditions. So, it was to be provided only for 5 years, and the maximum amount that the government could give in any particular year was 20,000. So, suppose private subscriptions in a particular year goes to say 27,000. So, the government will still give only 20,000 that year and not matching 27,000. But sometimes because of the gradual loss of the initial enthusiasm as in the starting years, so the subscription generation was low. So, for instance, so it was as low as 2,500 per year, and therefore the government's contribution, though it allowed for a maximum of 20,000, but some years, because the subscription collected was as low as 2,500, the government's side was also only that much. And also there is that interesting difficulty coming up for the case for government support. So, when it was discovered that the Dufferin Fund Central Committee and the provincial branches have been receiving some kind of government support, but which was not shown explicitly in the accounting procedures, it was concealed. So, that was eventually, as I say, the truth will always come out sooner or later. So, when that was coming out, it was very embarrassing. So, these again pointed to further problems of leaving medical care to voluntary bodies. So, these kinds of accounting and the kinds of other responsibilities and irregularities complicated the problems. But the Dufferin Fund continued to justify looking for more grants while trying to maintain that facade of being a non-state voluntarist vehicle for healthcare organization provision, and with its ill-concealed links with the state. So, in fact, its connections with the state kept increasing, but then so it was very hardly concealed, but it maintained that facade that it was a non-state organization, and therefore building a case on that it deserves more funding. So, moving on to another topic. So, this is about the Lock Hospital. So, one of the most notorious institutions during the colonial era in terms of health. So, what is that? So, it is so it's about some sexual aspects concerning the army. So, it was common for Indian prostitutes to cater to the sexual needs of the military men. And as I said in an earlier lecture, most of the colonial men across the board came alone, not with their families, especially those at the lower levels. So across the board, whether it's a civil or army, and in particularly the difficult conditions of the army. So this was a particular issue, and so anyway, so it was very common for them reaching out to Indian prostitutes. But then there was a medical issue here, which was the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So that was causing a lot of concern. So it's in this context that the lock hospitals were set up. So they were set up for basically confining and treating the prostitutes who were suspected of having venereal diseases or other kinds of sexually transmitted diseases in the military cantonments all over India. And they were suppressed in 1833, but again reinstated under the Contagious Diseases Act. So it was a very official way of once again allowing prostitution, but monitored through this act. So this act of 1864 initially targeted British military stations, but later extended to both the cantonments of the British soldiers as well as the Indian women suspected of being prostitutes, so going beyond the cantonments. So this therefore introduced a new form of bodily regulation beyond the cantonments. And this was also used as an instrument to depict moral division between respectable and not so respectable women. So now expressed through the language and idioms of medicine and healthcare concerns of Western medicine. So the laws allowed for the forcible examination and detention of the women suspected of carrying any kind of sexually transmittable disease, and it was assumed that prostitution was the main cause for the spread of such infections, though there could be other kinds of ways in which it could spread. And so women found to have any of those kinds of diseases could be detained in a lock hospital for treatment and observation till it was considered that they were disease free and not dangerous to go out. So thus we see medicine becoming a new form of power to colonize Indian women's bodies and to discipline them. So another kind of a medicalization. And in 1878, in 77, 78, there was a particularly high level of venereal disease among the European troops. So much so that they had to set up a special committee to investigate how effective was this Contagious Disease Act in practice. So they found that there were some shortcomings in the act. So there was not even a proper definition of what constitutes a common prostitute. And so there was no compulsory mandatory registration for those prostitutes who were caught or convicted, and the powers of arresting them was also seen to be insufficient. It was there, but seen to be insufficient. So therefore, one government after another decided made its own decision. So the Bengal government, for instance, decided to restrict the application of the Contagious Disease Act based on these kinds of findings of the committee. And in Bombay presidency, again, so even here also there is financial constraint coming as an excuse. So there the Bombay Corporation allowed the act just to lapse in 1871, and the regulations were not reintroduced until 1880. And quite expectedly, the act faced criticism in Britain and in India, particularly as one would expect from religious groups such as the Salvation Army, basically on religious and moral grounds, because the act was seen as condoning immoral behavior, providing a system or the officially sanctioned system of licensed prostitution. So the evangelical organizations denounced the act in the name of God and humanity, and held several meetings and protests to condemn the measures. So, and Indian nationalists and women's groups, rights activists also condemned it. So, they also saw it as a form of racial and gender-based discrimination, as they targeted only Indian women, only women and Indian women, and were often used to justify mistreatment of Indian women by British officers and soldiers. So, there's that colonial cultural angle also brought into it, as I also said earlier. So, this offered a new way of colonizing and controlling and disciplining Indian women's bodies. So, therefore, when there was protest from the Indian side, so there was also that angle apart from the moral angle. Of course, there are some papers like the Hindu Patriot which in fact supported the act, citing that it was very effective in improving the health of the European troops. This was the original purpose. But generally, the Indian press also opposed the working of this act. So, as a result of these various kinds of pressure, the act was suspended in 1881 by Lord Ripon, who was seen generally as being liberal on several fronts. But they continued, the local hospitals continued in a covert way under new cantonment acts. So, what were these acts? So, these Military Cantonments Act of 1889, for instance, once again permitted the inspection and compulsory treatment of medical treatment of prostitutes who were caught. But again, the government in Britain directed the Indian government in 1894 to limit the scope of the Cantonment Acts, because it was again through this route it was disobeying the original suspension of the Contagious Diseases Act. So, accordingly, in 1895, legislation was passed stating that no rule under the Cantonment Act of 1889 should permit that kind of medical examination or compulsory treatment of prostitutes suspected of having any kind of sexually transmitted disease. But despite this kind of opposition and criticism, the CD Contagious Disease Act remained in force in India until 1914. So, when it was finally and formally repealed. Yet another important topic in colonial healthcare, especially with regard to women, is the question of Dais. So, this is again one of the other ways in which the colonial state extended its medical arm into the realm of Indian women in the name of health. So, what is the traditional Dais system? So, this is the Dais are basically midwives who assist in the childbirth. So, this was sought to be replaced by the colonial state by Western trained midwives. Why? So, these are the reasons, because the Dais were basically barbers' wives or lower caste women, though of course they played a very important role in childbirth and also post-birth assistance, like for instance helping the mother or the family giving birth to the child, and the other kinds of medical assistances, traditional assistances. But the problem is that so the methods they were using were seen as very barbaric and primitive, which had fatal consequences, leading to deaths of both mother or child or both. So, high rates of maternal and infant mortality. So, for instance, the census of India 1911 has this to say about the system. So, it is the common habit and custom in almost all districts to hand over the women in labor to the care of one of the dirtiest, most backward, illiterate, ignorant and superstitious classes, the barber midwife. The result of this custom is that untold misery and unnumbered unnecessary deaths are meted out to the parturient women of this country by these untrained and unclean practitioners. So, thus this issue of Dais system was framed, or midwifery as such was framed, as a conflict between a progressive and a humane West and a very backward, superstitious, barbaric East. But of course, it was not always versus the whites versus the non-whites. So, in course of time, Indians themselves looked at the Dais system as being comparatively a bit crude and backward, and they willingly supported the changes towards modern scientific midwifery. Indians by choice themselves chose the hospital option rather than delivery of child at home. Of course, so even to this day there are parts of India where delivery is done at homes, but even during this time, so there was this change in attitude, so there was more and more of people going to hospital for childbirth. So this, as we can see, as influence of Western medicalization, another example of medicalization. So where childbirth, which would normally have been seen as something very private, social, and done in a very indigenous way, traditional way, so now becomes more medicalized. So with the midwife being properly trained, both proper medical training. And so in this context, we also have to mention there was also a general concern about reproductive health and of mothers, and generally about so women themselves, irrespective of the mother or young girls. Then also in the context of the fact that maternal mortality was considerably high compared to the rates in Western countries. And this was, of course, due to effects of poverty, poor nutrition, and also many social, cultural factors like, say, for instance, the parda and isolation and other such things. And so this continued to be an important concern. So the neglect of maternal health, and particularly in state-funded medical research and practical measures. So as we saw, the state had a lot of research labs, research initiatives in fields like bacteriology, parasitology, and even in nutrition and other such things, but there wasn't much with regard to questions of women's health in particular, and as always with regard to practical healthcare too. So there wasn't much from the government side. So this was a important criticism about the colonial healthcare. So on that note, we will close this lecture. Thank you.